Okay, good morning. We are back in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. We had talked a couple of weeks ago about how murder begins in the heart. And, you know, this whole idea here on the Sermon on the Mount is how Jesus is explaining that it's not just the external acts that are important, but it's the motivation and the condition of the heart that is just as important. So if we're going to be acceptable to God, that righteousness must come from the heart, because God places a great deal of emphasis on that. So he judges the source or the origin of our sin, not just the action or the lack of action, of course. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he, the wise man Solomon said. So we're in Matthew 5. We're going to begin. We'll read verses 27 through 30. And we'll see how it is very similar to how he talks about murder. Verse 27 of Matthew 5. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it's more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And so the dictionary definition of adultery is basically having the sex act with a married person, all right, with someone that you are not married to. If you look at the Greek words for adultery here that's used, and it is basically something that's unlawful, and again, you have it with another person's spouse. And that is the whole idea here behind this. And of course, we know that throughout the Bible, this idea of adultery, there's also a spiritual adultery that the Bible talks about, where God's people went off and went to other religions and worshipped other idols and gods, and that was spiritual adultery. Okay? Obviously here he is talking about physical adultery, and the idea is that you are breaking a covenant. In other words, when you are married, you get married, you enter into a covenant, a contract, an agreement, whatever we might want to call it. And so this original idea is that when you commit adultery, you're breaking your vows. In other words, you are not carrying through your obligations. And so he says here, you have heard that it was said to those of old. And of course, with a lot of the Pharisees, they would follow one rabbi, or another one would follow another rabbi, and we'll see that also in the next section on marriage. And one rabbi would say this, another rabbi would say that. But it all goes back to this idea of it's not just external. That's what he's stressing. Some of the rabbis would teach that as long as you weren't engaged in the physical act, it didn't make any difference about anything else. Well, that's what Jesus is saying here. You may have heard that from those of old in times past, but he says, that's what I say to you, and because he's the one in authority now. He's the one that is if you want to call it, making the laws, making the rules. And so there's the contrast. You've heard it said to those of old, but I say to you, it's not just the physical act. He says it's also the heart, the spirit, the mind, the attitude. So adultery here, it violates the marriage relationship. Would someone read, because this kind of goes along with it, Matthew 12, verses 34 and 35. Matthew 12, 34 and 35. Okay?
Fruit of vipers, how can you, being evil, be good things?
Is that it?
Did you read 35 also?
Well, I'm going to.
Oh,
For
okay.
out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. A good man, out of the good treasure of his heart, brings forth good things. And an evil man, out of the evil treasure, brings forth evil things.
See, there goes to the heart issue, the spirit, the attitude issue. So he says, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her, all right? Jesus is putting his words, his authority, if you want that, call it that, above the traditional view that they have heard in the past. He says, this view, because of who I am, this is being put above what you've heard in the past. The traditions of the rabbis. And they have been passed down through centuries. That's what the Talmud is in Jewish thought. That's what it's called. It's a whole book of traditions that the Jewish people follow. So he says, if you're lusting for her, and this word has the idea of desiring something to possess it. Of course, you can lust for anything. You can lust not just for people, you can lust for wealth or possessions or honor, prestige. You can lust for anything. It's the idea of basically you're going to do anything possible to possess this. That's the idea of lusting. Now, along with that, let's read James 1, 14 and 15. Okay?
But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and to sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death.
All right. There's kind of the progression. All right? Obviously, being tempted is not sinful because Jesus was tempted many, many, many times. It's not the temptation. So, what many had done in the first century, and even before with these rabbis and so forth, they had tried to rationalize, as long as the physical act was not committed, then everything was fine. That's how they were trying to rationalize away God's word. Well, he says, looks at a woman. Well, looks here is a present participle, which basically means we've got the idea of ongoing. All right? Ongoing. Something that continues to go on. Continuous action. So we're talking about, not just an incidental look or an involuntary glance. This is something that's intentional, and you're trying to satisfy some sort of evil desire, sinful desire. That's what you're doing. So let's look at a couple of places. Let's go to Romans chapter 6, first of all. If someone would read verse 12. Romans 6, verse 12.
Therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body, so that you reign in therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body so that you obey its lust.
All right. See, there's that same word again, lust. So he says, don't let it reign in your mortal body. In other words, don't let that be your all-consuming passion. All right? And also, this goes along with it, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 3. Ephesians 2, verse 3.
Among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others.
Okay, notice, at one time we all once conducted ourselves in the lust of our flesh. And again, this is the idea of intentional looking, for that purpose, to satisfy sinful desires, evil desires. And, we go back and think about David and Bathsheba. There wasn't anything wrong with David seeing Bathsheba. The point was he kept looking at Bathsheba. And that's the difference between the two. And that's what Jesus is talking about here as well. So we have, back in our, there we go. He says that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This stresses that the inward part is just as important as the outward part. Looking doesn't cause you to commit adultery, all right? It is what is going on in your heart. That's what Jesus is stressing. What's the condition of your heart? What's the condition of your mind? What's your motivation? What's your desire? So he says, already committed adultery with her in his heart. See, you don't have to actually commit the physical act. That's what Jesus is saying. So, even in the Old Testament, we have that this idea of sin starts in the heart. Let's go back to Job. And remember, Job was written a long, long time ago, during the patriarchal time. This is Job 31. Make sure I've got the right place. Job 31. Yeah. I'm going to begin in verse 1 of Job 31. I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? For what is the allotment of God from above and the inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is it not destruction for the wicked and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does he not see my ways and count all my steps? If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceive, let me be weighed on honest scales that God may know my integrity. If my step is turned from the way, or my heart walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hands, then let me sow and another eat. Yes, let my harvest be rooted out. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. For that would be wickedness. Yes, it would be iniquity deserving of judgment. For that would be a fire that consumes the destruction and would root out all my increase. See, again, he's talking about that, making a covenant. All right? It's all about making that covenant. Job knew, in that section we read, that it's all about what starts inside. He knew he was deserving of punishment if he had actually done, what some maybe had thought he had done. So, what he says back in Matthew then, the last part of our reading says, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it's more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it's more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Now, we have to take this understanding, of course, that our right eye doesn't work apart from my brain. My brain's what causes my right eye to work. Same way with my hand. It's not my right eye's fault or my right hand's fault. I can't blame it on my hand or my eye, because Jesus is stressing it's inside. It's inside your head. It's inside your mind. That's what you have to be careful about. So, he's stressing, all right, take whatever measures are necessary to keep you from committing this adultery. Whatever that is. He doesn't want you to, literally cutting your hand off is not going to keep you from sinning. That's not going to help at all. It's got to go to the inside. That doesn't cleanse the heart. So, especially in the Jewish society, Jewish culture, whatever, right eye and right hand, that was like your best. All right, that was like your best part, your best faculties was represented by your right eye, your right hand. So, what you need to do is take whatever steps are necessary. That's what he is stressing here. Watch for traps. We might put it like that. Watch for traps. Eliminate them. If you know of a weakness for you, then watch it. Watch out for them. Don't be trapped. Where we go, what we do, And again, it would be different for everybody. Apostle Paul, same thing with him. He said he had to work on it all the time. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 9. Can someone read that last verse in the chapter, verse 27?
But I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified.
See, the Apostle Paul, he was inspired to write all these letters, and he had the power to even raise people from the dead. But what did he have to do? He still had to discipline his body. He still had to bring it into subjection. So, regardless of who you are, even an apostle had to do this. Because Paul sinned, just like everybody else. Paul did just what James talked about there in James 1. He sinned in that progression just like everybody else did. So that's why Paul said, I have to watch out for traps. I have to discipline my body. So just like everybody else does. And let's go to Romans 13 for another place here. Verse 14. Romans 13:14. If someone would read that for us.
But put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts.
Okay, there's the idea. Make no provision. Okay, take whatever measures are necessary, whatever that happens to be for you. And this would be an individual thing. And of course, that's extremely important in our society as well to do that, just like it was in the first century and just like it was in the past. So whatever is necessary. Well, this goes right into, then he talks about marriage. Furthermore, verse 31, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Okay, there's the, it has been said. All right, this is what Jesus has been doing all along here. He's been clarifying, explaining, whatever we want to call it, from what the rabbis have been teaching and all of this. So he says, you've heard it said that whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. The rabbis had vastly different opinions about divorce. So in that first century, you would find all kinds of Jewish rabbis teaching all kinds of explanations of divorce. And, what was acceptable, what wasn't under the law of Moses. And so there were all kinds of schools of thought in the first century. So Jesus is saying, you've heard it said, if you want to divorce your wife, you've got to give her this certificate of divorce. But what does he do? Verse 32. But I say to you. And that's what he's been doing throughout most of chapter 5. All right? Things are different now. There's a new sheriff in town, so to speak. So things are different. Whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. So there's the general principle, all right? And of course, there's other places in the New Testament that further clarifies things. Paul talks about that in the book of Romans. He talks about it in 1 Corinthians as well, about marriage, talks about divorce, talks about, who you should marry if you do get divorced. So he talks about all of those things. So Jesus, again, is clarifying, all right, he's clarifying divorce for any reason? No. Because that is not acceptable. He says, the rabbis may have taught that it was okay, if you didn't like how your wife cooked, you could divorce her. Or if you didn't like how your wife dressed, you could divorce her. Jesus said all those reasons are out the door. They're not acceptable at all for any reason like that. He says the only thing here, he says, is sexual immorality, which is a somewhat broad term. If I remember right, it's the Greek word porneo, or porneia. And it is a broad term. But he says this is the reason, this is the exception. And again, other places talk about this as well. And he says this is what allows the covenant. We're going back to this idea of covenant, agreement, testament. This is what breaks the covenant. That breaks the covenant. A wife's cooking doesn't break the covenant. How a wife dresses doesn't break the covenant. This, he says, breaks the covenant. And he says this is what, if you want to say, is acceptable. And of course, he goes on and talks more about it in Matthew 19. If you want to go there now. Still more words of Jesus. This is considerably later in his ministry. He talks about, beginning in verse 3 of Matthew 19, says, the Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? There again, that was, some of the rabbis were teaching that in the first century. You could divorce your wife for any old reason you wanted. So the Pharisees are trying to trap him. They're wanting him to say something that's going to get him into trouble, basically. So he answered and said to them, have you not read? Of course, the Pharisees knew these words. They knew it. Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, going all the way back to the first few chapters of Genesis? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. He says this is where marriage comes from. It comes from God. He's the one that started marriage. So this was before there were basically patriarchs. This was before there was sacrifices. This was before the law of Moses. This goes all the way back, like he says, to the beginning. He says he made them male and female. And so right here we see the only people that God approves of to get married are males and females. A male marrying a female. No one else can have an acceptable marriage. Has to be a male, has to be a female. Now that's as clear and plain as anything could possibly be written. No one else, in God's eyes anyway, can be married. Not two males, not two females. Male and female only. And he says, that is a reason that a man shall leave his father and mother. All right, that's where the marriage comes from. So then, verse 6, they are no longer two, but one flesh. This goes back to why sexual immorality is what breaks the contract. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Okay, God doesn't join together two males in marriage or two females in marriage. Now, the country may, but not God. So they come back, verse 7, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? All right, and we're still talking about all the different ideas in the first century about marriage and divorce. So he said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, there's the reason right there, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality, there's that same exact expression, and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. And his disciples came back and said, wow, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. Well, it's better not to marry if you're not going to abide by what God has said. Oh, here comes Stephen and Ginger. So he says that's what's important. Okay? That's what's important. All right, well, our time is up, so we'll stop there. And Lord willing, we'll pick up next week on oaths. And again, it's going to be the same issue coming to us. All right.